In terms of climate change being real, I've never really had a doubt. I mean, I think the science is pretty clear on that. It's in the literature. You don't have to go digging for it. It's not some conspiracy theory. I think we've been watching it affect the way that the globe works for a long time. We've known since the 60s that CO2 was going to be bad for the environment. Exxon knew in the 80s.
I've never doubted it. It seems quite obvious when you think about the impact that humans have on our planet, and just we are in a position to control what happens, in the habitats that we're in. And anyone who has taken a science course, I feel, should know that we're all connected. All of these things, ecosystems are connected, and on such a thin web, that of course wastefulness and toxic chemicals and pollution are all going to impact. And I feel that climate change is just this large term that really is asking us all to pay attention to our daily behaviors and habits and our jobs as stewards of the planet.
When you see the weight of evidence, it's impossible not to believe that humans are responsible. If you do this much reading on the issues related to climate change, environment, it becomes really obvious that 99% of the scientists who study this in the world are convinced that humans have an impact on climate change. I don't think I could say that there's any one particular fact that led me to that conclusion. It's just the weight of all of the evidence. So whether it's the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere or other greenhouse gases, the rising sea levels, the melting glaciers, the destruction of habitat. I mean, I could go on and on. So it's just the weight of all of those factors. I don't know how anybody could think differently. In some ways, we're pretty insulated from some of the impacts, and it's not as obvious. We don't have big forest fires here, things like that. So, but we're all part of this world, and we're all connected together. And so, if something is happening in another continent related to climate change, it somehow is going to affect me in some ways. So none of us is separate from the whole.
I do think climate change is real, and it has been real for several decades. And as humans, we definitely have had an impact, and perhaps from what I've read, actually exacerbated climate change outside of a regular environmentally developmental curve of what's going on with our global ecosystem.
Yes, climate change is 100% real. I grew up in a tropical island, the beautiful place of Puerto Rico, and we can see that firsthand. So I'm 100% sure that we are part of it, and we have to do something to resolve it. The scientists, they're saying that it's going to be worse and worse, and it's going to be more intense. And of course, if they're going to affect my parents, it's going to affect me personally. Not just that. Every year I travel to the tropical island, and we can see the coast, and the erosion there is not the best. And of course here too, look at this winter. It's a weird winter for us. Something is too cold, and the next day is too hot. That affect us, everybody.
I have a 29-year-old daughter, and when she was younger, National Geographic was one of her favorite magazines, and we would look it over. And I remember looking at National Geographics when I was a child, and just to then revisit that almost 20 years later, as my daughter was 9 or 10, and thinking about the content and what different places looked like in the world from when I was a child to the magazines that we were looking at, I started seeing really profound changes, and it perked up, I would say, my curiosity, but also concern.
I have family members on both coasts who are impacted through wildfires or flooding. And, I think unfortunately it's those moments, it has to impact you personally for human nature to kick in and for us to make the changes that we need. And unfortunately, I don't think we have that kind of time. So it doesn't impact me directly other than emotionally and mentally. I'm aware that at every moment is a moment lost if you're not taking action.
These problems are beyond the scale. I mean, when you see that what's been going on in Australia with the wildfires, the Syrian civil war started in a drought, you know, the displacements of people are going to be real. And they're already happening. It just hasn't happened to the us yet, right? It hasn't happened on our side yet, although it's probably, you know, it's been happening in California for sure with the wildfires and landslides and the heavy rains. It's happening in the South, 6 inches of rain in a weekend. People are, you know, hillsides just falling into rivers. So I have a good degree of panic about it. The systems we've built, you know, the global capitalist marketplace, are much too complex to survive the types of changes that are coming down the road with climate change and then the refugee problems that are coming. So it's kind of become our job to manage the panic about it and to include it, to make sure that we're panicked all the time. And I don't trust people who aren't. I think that getting the word out, like, we can't do enough. You know, I have faith in the kids these days. Extinction Rebellion, I think, is on the right path. They're really trying to disrupt things to make people see that we're paying a price already for what we've been in the habit of doing. I have a PhD in American literature, 19th century American literature, but my focus at the time, when I wrote my dissertation, was on literature and the environment, right? So I was really interested in how we represent nature in our stories. And so as I've been telling the story, even of the Shays story, and the protests that they mounted in 1786, these anti-austerity protests, I'm trying to show as much as I can that the farmers were deeply influenced by the natural world. They were beholden to the cycles. They were small farmers. What they could get out of the ground was what they had to live on. And for the Scots-Irish farmers who were living in the hill towns, there's kind of some overlap with the primitive skills. You know, they're taking their dyes, they're dyeing, they brought flax culture to North America from Europe, but they're dyeing their fabric with roots, they're dyeing it with bark, they're dyeing it with their vegetables. They're making, you know, candles out of bayberry wax, they're making candle wicks out of the milkweed floss, right? So these are the people, 1786 is not that long ago. And these are people who are living really close to the land. And then in 1786, the problem was that the European markets were collapsing. Americans couldn't sell their goods in the Indies. And now the little bit that they needed from European factories was disturbed. Most of the time, they could go back to nature and live a pretty good life. Telling that story now, it's clear that we can't just do that. I mean, a lot of people have these fantasies about being able to go back to the land. But most of the time, they're fantasies. You know, in terms of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people within a couple hours drive of here, if anything goes wrong, the vulnerability in this system is really profound. Again, I'm not looking for this stuff. I'm not going out searching for radical literature about this. The Uninhabitable Earth was reviewed in the New Yorker, you know, and they're saying, forget 2 degrees, forget 350 parts per million, we're going to 11 degrees Celsius. And at that point, 97% of life is not going to be sustainable because the cascading collapses, it's going to get ugly quick. And they're not talking, they were talking like, 2100, we got time for science to fix this. They're already saying that the effects are greater than they expected 70 years from now. The idea that the baby boomers raised us into this world and we just know what the seasons are and those seasons will keep going forever, I think that's out the window at this point. The idea of continuity. It's just flip a coin. It might be 50, 60 degrees. We just had 70 degrees in the Antarctic. I think the red flags should be going up all the time. If that comes down to just being the difficult person in a conversation and injecting that little bit of reality, that's the sword I can fall on. But I don't think that we can afford to ignore this anymore. And it does seem like there are going to be just kind of islands of people taking care of each other, and then big territories where people are just, good luck, you're on your own. You know, when we saw this first with the rooftops in New Orleans, We saw it again with New York City with Superstorm Sandy. You know, these infrastructures that we thought were going to be great, just all of a sudden a storm comes through and they're not there.
What we can do is education. I think education is the key, and we have to start with the little kids, how to properly recycle, how to properly save water, how to properly do a lot of stuff. It's weird and it's sad that we have to react all the time instead of being more proactive. We have to change the mentality of everybody and be more proactive and do our part to save our planet.
You can buy things nowadays that are made of recyclable materials. I mean, or all natural things. Avoid plastics, too many plastics.
In our family, we have metal straw, and we bring it everywhere. That single stuff make the difference. Now my wife have a hybrid car. It's not perfect, but if we have chargers everywhere, that will be a huge change for our system. So that way more people can move to electric cars.
You can choose what you eat for our environment, for the animals, for your health. I don't think people realize that eating animals has a major carbon footprint. I don't think people get that. But people can do it gradually. I did it gradually. But, you know, there's vegan coaches out there that can help you. If you go online, you know, you can get help. You can read books. You can join groups. There's one in the area, actually. Valley Vegan Society, Valley Vegan and Vegetarian Society, and my group, Western Mass Animal Rights Advocates. I'm on the Agawam Conservation Commission, and every year there's a conference, Mass Association of Conservation Commissions. They have often very little other than animal stuff. Like they have a lot of meat at their lunch. And I'm like, how can you're an environmental organization, how can you not have anything vegan? In fact, you should only have vegan food here. I mean, you know how much, I wrote them a long email complaining and giving them facts. It's like, you know, how can you be passionate about the environment? Obviously, either they're stubborn or they just don't get it. It's one or the other. If our government did not subsidize all those animal farms and our government promoted veganism and people were awakened, the healthcare systems, they would really suffer. People would be having far fewer health problems. The problem is, though, that they make more money when people get sick. So why would they do that, you know? And I know a lot of people who just don't care. They just want to keep eating their meat or having their dairy, you know. They don't care. They'd rather die younger. They'd rather risk getting cancer. They'd rather have a higher risk of getting diseases. I have to just continue. I have to make the most of my life. I have to educate others. I'm not just going to do it and not spread the word. Since I was a little kid, I've always had a passion, a strong bond with nature and animals, and the environment. I've always felt that connection, and I felt it's my responsibility to do everything within my power to help. I was born with that passion in me. So I'm putting that to work. I think when you're born with something, you gotta make use of it, you know?
Yeah, I decided a long time ago that the most important thing that I could do to heal this planet is to protect important land and natural resources that we still have, because if we don't protect these things, they'll get developed and spoiled, and there's plenty of places that are appropriate for development, but there's a lot of places that shouldn't be developed, and that's my focus.
individual responsibility to the environment, I think, is, paramount. It takes one person to change the world, and people changing together and evolving together towards one common purpose is really how we got here today. And it's how we kind of get out of this going forward. The use of technology and unsiloing parts of our community and our global systems is really, I feel, the only possible way that you and I are having this conversation today, and having the same conversation in 20 years talking about better breathing, or at least, if nothing else, keep us where we are now. And that starts with when I go shopping. And if I'm buying straws, or what I'm buying, am I buying a bag of lettuce, or am I buying a head of lettuce that has no plastic on it? Every little bit changes. I always think about the 6-pack holders, the plastic when you buy soda, and cutting those up. I think about saving one turtle. It makes me smile and motivates me to cut my plastic 6-pack handles. My consumption habits have evolved over the last several decades, and in the last couple of years have certainly evolved, where it's very much forward in my consciousness of what changes that I need to make, and observing my current patterns. The use of plastic utensils. I now carry my bamboo utensils in my bag. I have an extra set at home and an extra set in my office. I pay much more attention to the cleaning products I use to make sure that they don't have harmful chemicals, and much to my surprise, those products that I mostly make myself clean my house and my clothes and my office just as well as the bottle of Lysol with antimicrobial yabba dabba dabba chemicals that actually make me sneeze a lot. And it's always, I'm making purchases and making choices with the use of my energy in my house, with a much clearer idea and focus on what happens in the next 10 years and where we'll be as a society and a planet in 20 years. What motivates me are kids. I look out my window and I look over the bike path in my home, and from my office I look at the promenade on the pond, and the vitality and the curiosity, and then the really unmitigated joy of our young people is a great motivation. To not have that spirit and energy on our planet, or to have that spirit and energy dampened by my choices today, is really very heavy and dark. And I prefer to walk forward into the light.
I started the journey of really being thoughtful about what I had in my home probably 10 years ago, and it starts slowly. It probably started with purchasing microfiber cloths, and I probably still have the same ones that I bought, and I haven't bought paper towels in over a decade, and I don't miss them. And I had 2 children and animals in my home with them, and I didn't need a paper towel. And I used cloth diapers, and I even had people argue with me, and I have read studies on it, about how cloth diapering uses as much water as it does to create a plastic diaper, a disposable diaper. But you know what, my children's diapers have been given to other children and have been used on multiple babies. And when they're done, you can use it as a rag, you can stuff it in a pillow, you can put it in your garden as a weed mat, you can compost it. It's not going to be here, there's not a diaper sitting in a landfill somewhere because I was selfish enough to create my own child, and so once I got to that point, then you start off small, and then you start to see all these other places in your life where you can make these alterations. So then I started making my own oil that I would wash my face with. And then once I did that, then I started making our own toothpaste. And then once I started making our own toothpaste, then I looked into bamboo toothbrushes. And it's always a process. And it can be really, it can feel very weighty, and it can be exhausting, because you go to buy the bamboo toothbrush sold individually, and it's wrapped in plastic, and you think, well, what's the point? But then, the give and take of whether Facebook is good or not, you find communities and then you find out ways to order bamboo toothbrushes that come wrapped in cardboard boxes, and you get a deal on 14 of them, so they're only being shipped to your house once, and now you've got your toothbrushes for the year. But that also means that you had to have the money to be able to afford to do that. And so I think there's some give and take that those of us who have the, $15 to get those toothbrushes should do that. And maybe then share them with people who can't. Then I started to compartmentalize it, look at how we could make alterations in the bathroom specifically around our hygiene. So, and you just kind of check it off as you go. We got the toothpaste, we got the toothbrushes, we started using a shampoo bar that they sell right here in town that's made in Pennsylvania. It's not that far. And then you learn about the fact that we have hard water and that affects the way our hair and our skin is. And you just become so much more knowledgeable. And it's not about running to CVS and buying the shampoo that you saw a commercial about. It's making your own progress and not looking for someone else to make you beautiful or to change your life because a product was marketed towards you. And then there's also, especially as a busy working mom, the more I do this, the more simple our life becomes. The less product we have in our house, the less smothered I feel by materials. And so there's also a lot of personal gain in living with less. And there's a really challenge in it, an exciting challenge in trying to figure out how we can live this way. And I think about it all the time. We're only really 2 or 3 generations removed from our sustainable ancestors. And that the industrial era and the World War II and post-World War II era really removed us from that oral tradition of passing on habits that were renewable. If I want to can something, I have to look in a book. I have to look it up online. I have to watch some YouTuber teach me how to can because my grandmother didn't teach me how to can because the supermarket was doing it for us. And I had to learn how to wash diapers from online. And then we've disconnected ourselves from our sustainable habits, and we now have to just start as a community, educating each other and sharing these resources with each other. And I found it so wonderful to find out, where do you buy this? Where do you buy that? And also allowing yourself to be imperfect in the process. And I certainly am not always good at that. I definitely feel very hopeless sometimes. I feel overwhelmed by it. But it always is renewed when I am in the presence of someone else who's also on that journey, who might have a piece of information like, how to make your own oat milk, or how, where they bought the products for it, or just something that makes it feel possible, that it's not overwhelming. And I think another thing that can be really difficult is feeling like you're the only one that's doing it. And that is a falsehood that we can't really allow ourselves to sink into. Because once you put yourself in that place where you feel surrounded by people who don't share your values, you can lose your hope, you can lose your stamina. And I think that the more we communicate with each other and the more we have positive conversations with people who might not be there yet, it's a slow journey, but every once in a while, a coworker might say to me, well, I know that you wash your hair with something else. What do you wash your hair with? Or what are you doing to make this? And then you share something with them and you kind of become a spokesperson for this movement. And that has to be a way to renew your own belief in it and not feel like you're the only one out there. People are thinking about it. And you also have to be kind. Sometimes I find myself frustrated that other people aren't right here at the same place in the journey that I'm at, because I feel like it's been going on forever. I mean, I'm 40 years old, and these aren't new concepts. this idea of an overpopulated planet, it existed before I was born. You know, the idea of sustaining and protecting our natural resources and our natural landscapes predates me generations. But here I am trying to convince my own parents that, you know, it's worth composting their coffee grounds, you know, versus putting them in the trash can, and, you know, the chemical reactions that happen from doing that, you know. And I think that everybody has their own version of what their hard work is in their life, and for me, this is something that is my hard work, and I feel I won't ever give up on. You know, there are other things that I find to be meaningful, but I feel like this is it. Like, and at the heart of it, I feel, who are we to think that our wants and our needs rise above the creatures and the environment that we live in? And it feels very selfish and oblivious, really, if you don't feel that way. And I struggle to understand how humans who have cats and dogs that they love and horses that they love, and, you know, they love going to the beach and they love going to the lake and being in the woods, don't see the correlation of how we can protect those things, and really what our job is. You know, for whatever reason, we've been given the ability to be in power on the planet, and how are we going to use it? You know, are we going to keep feeding our own desires and our own individual daily needs and wants, or are we going to see it as a way to be a leader, right, of an entire planet? And I think that's what's really going to have to happen, is that idea that we have to share ideas and methods and habits individually and locally and state to state and country to country until we're all really on board. And I think it's a combination of large movements and little small movements of people interacting with each other. And I just hope that it picks up speed really quickly.
In terms of changes that I've made, I've just, I got the farm share. I've been getting my vegetables in bulk, you know, straight from the organic farmers, and really making those last as long as possible through the summer. It's a 5-month farm share. And I think next year I might have the courage to go for the 90 pounds winter share to get through the winter as well. But that's a little tricky not having a root cellar, a cold, you know, dark, cold place that you can put stuff. So no, I think that it's mostly, in terms of what I'm doing, it's, you know, the consumerism, where my money goes, and like I was saying, being willing to keep the environment, keep the atmosphere in the conversation, and not just to blow it off with, beautiful weather today, 45 degrees in February, it's gorgeous. I just can't do it, you know. I hear the earth crying, you know, I hear it collapsing. It's like, we should be hearing the sound of a nervous breakdown around us all the time. And if you've been around otherwise strong people who are going through that, what they're saying doesn't make sense, and they don't have access to their own voice, and they're feeling torn apart, that's what the earth is doing right now. So you think about your grandmother when she lost her husband. You think about your friends who got the diagnosis and the horror they felt to think that this thing was inside of them. You know, you think about whatever the loss was, you feel that emotion coming up. That's what the earth is doing right now. We're not listening. We hear it. I think we're smart enough. We know what we're doing. We're not connected yet with ways to, I would say, ritualize that knowledge, like to make that knowledge action. We're still waiting for it. So I love that you're doing this, because I think that it just needs to be momentum. And I think people need to see it around them. They need to hear it in their throats. They need somebody to translate for what the earth is telling them, so that it seems like a person. Because, man, everything that I read about what that person is feeling is just despair. The coral, I mean, the list is just terrifying. The coral reefs, you know, the insects, the bats. For me, the way that I do it is just, and this is something that I'm including in the book that I'm writing, is we've normalized roadkill to the point where we don't even see it. But every 6-year-old kid driving down the road sees the feathers sticking up, or the foxtail, or the deer with its craned neck. And that kid knows to be horrified. And the parents have to tell them this story about how important it is to get to soccer practice, or whatever. Well, this is what happens. It's a shame. We just drive and, they run out in front of, under our wheels. It's a shame. What can you do? Adults don't even see it. You know, and I've got Native friends who will stop and take the bodies and pray over them and give them a proper burial. That doesn't even seem that radical. You know, we proceed over dead bodies regularly. If you own a car, you have driven over a dead body in the last 24 hours. We need to start feeling the people in that. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to tell people to do it. But now that I've started feeling those bodies and feeling the little raccoon people mourning for that raccoon, they have families. They're not just matter. They know when somebody's gone from their group. We are just not in the habit of acting like that knowledge matters to us. And I feel like the least I'm going to do is act like that knowledge is real and start my days from there, instead of starting it with jumping out of bed with the radio and the music in the shower and the car and the going to work and pretending like that routine is natural. So some days it feels radical, some days it feels like I'm not doing anything at all. But I don't know, I feel like our culture we keep so much hidden from ourselves that just seeing it has just kind of become radical. Just to say, yeah, this isn't normal. And we're seeing it politically now. People are saying this is not normal is like a new slogan. This isn't how it should be. But I think just getting people uncomfortable, getting people to recognize that they should be personally uncomfortable is the start. So I think that's where anything is going to have to happen, whether you disrupt it by closing the roads down or staging protests. It's that connection where people realize, there are people on the other side of this. So anything I think people can do to create that connection where it's people suffering this, and the earth is one of the people. We can't do enough of that. It can't happen fast enough.
I don't think that many people are that conscious of it, and we're really at the mercy of the corporations that produce our products, and until they decide that they're going to change, I don't know how much we're going to be able to do as a people to affect a big change there. So unless we stand up and say enough is enough, no more, find some alternatives, then we'll continue down this road. And we're just covering the planet in plastic. There's so much evidence of that. It's terribly sad to see the effect on the natural world with plastic. There is some hope, I think, that technology will be developed that will break down the plastics over time. They've even been doing some studies with using a certain kind of mushroom that decomposes plastics. But these are solutions that are going to take a long time to implement, and it's going to be a matter of the multinational corporations deciding that's the way to go, instead of continuing down the petrochemical highway that we've been on for a long time now.
When we think about our plastic use, again, in City Hall, but also in our daily life, I think we start with education. education of exactly what the plastics are or aren't doing, being very clear about what plastics can be reused, and also what plastics can't be reused and what the substitutes are for those plastics. And I think that goes down to a very minute choice of when we're grocery shopping and we're looking at our Ziploc bags or we're looking at Ziploc containers, and asking and knowing for sure what the impact of those plastics are in our environment, to understand what is biodegradable, what is recyclable, but also when we're buying products that are made of recycled materials, what are those materials, what the impact is on the earth, and if those materials that are recycled within, say, a glass, does that make the glass or the cup more recyclable? And that's, I just learned that egg containers, paper egg containers, aren't necessarily recyclable as paper. And that pizza boxes with grease in them can contaminate a paper batch of recycling. And education is first and foremost. I think if you bring awareness up on the public, on all levels of public education, we'll see a switch in buying patterns and also recycle patterns. Part two is looking at local, state, and federal ordinances and mandates around what we're using plastics for and if they are absolutely needed for the product that they contain or the product that we use made with those recyclables. And if there is a more environmentally conscious option, then we should be directed to those options. And that impact, I think, it's a slow roll, but it's an immediate need roll, and will, I think, impact for good the global crisis that we're facing with climate.
So recently we were reading a magazine, Popular Science, from 1952, and it was filled with ads about the benefits of plastic and how plastic was really going to change your life. And it's really sad to think about how that's how we work. Someone can, or our culture and advertising and companies can really play to our emotions and our needs and our wants and desires and convince us that something is positive, right? And I think that unfortunately, there's fear in change, and people are afraid, and threatened by this idea that we have to decrease our use in plastic. And, there's a lot of arguments around how sometimes the alternatives aren't any better, that they use up a lot of water or that they still use up materials. But I think the process of coming up with solutions has to happen, and it's not going to be perfect our first try, but this idea that we're just going to depend on a material that doesn't degrade, it doesn't make sense to me. I would rather have a resource that we have to renew, but at least we can renew it. There's some flexibility in that. The plastic waste that we already have on the planet is well beyond what it should have ever been. So this idea that we're still producing and we're still using, and just the impact of being around people each day who still are walking around with a Dunkin' Donuts cup sometimes is so painful for me, because I can't understand how they don't see that correlation and they can't make that shift from my need to have this liquid every day in replace of, landscapes being their natural state and not being covered in plastic. I find it really disturbing and upsetting.
I don't trust the plastic bag bans and the plastic straw bans, and I get that it's important. I get that there's small steps and we have to build that, but what I see happening is people, you'll see it at the supermarkets. Do you want to save the environment by using a recyclable bag? And I think, screw you. We're going to have to do so much more than take all of our plastically wrapped goods home from the store in something other than a plastic bag. Like, everything in the bag is wrapped in plastic already. So I think we need to think on a bigger scale, and I think that we're going to need to think about what we consume and where it comes from and the transportation costs associated with getting it to us. I don't think you can think about any of these questions without thinking about class and corporations and their power over us. I think that we've been living in kind of a very strategically hidden supply chain to bring us all of the conveniences for modern life. And that supply chain is where the pollution happens. So whatever we do on the consumer end is really tiny. But I think that we are going to need to trust the scientists and say, at the very least, we need to start scaling back the oil production. We need to stop lighting it up, which is going to be tricky because the U.S. military is one of the biggest producers of CO2. So I think that as the crises happen, I hope that, and this is the way that I think societies change, is a big storm happens, infrastructure gets knocked over, and there's a strategic opportunity to make the decision, what are you going to rebuild in this wasteland that's just been created? And I think that there are reasons for optimism as well. I just saw an article yesterday about filling in the mountaintop removal mining in Appalachia. There are people now planting trees trying to bring those mountains back. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism. I think there's a lot of work to be done. But I also think that if things are actually going to change on the timeline we need, people like Greta Thunberg are going to be leaders of the world. I think that Extinction Rebellion is really exciting because these are people who they're planning to disrupt the infrastructure that we've got to add this tax. The worst thing we could have right now is gasoline at $2.35 a gallon, because there's no incentive to quit.
When you look back in history, especially in American history, there are these moments in time where we activate as a nation and we increase growth. There's this progress for the benefit of everyone, right? Whether it's industrial era, World War II, post-World War II, where the government creates new departments, new programs for large things that create jobs, create revenue, increase our economy. I don't understand how we can't shift the existing programs and jobs into jobs that have a renewable target. And I really think that's where it has to come. But I think, as in anything, change is uncomfortable for people, and that unknown is uncomfortable. But I think we have to be open-minded. And I know the plans are there. We have to mobilize them. I've made a lot of efforts in my personal life and in my family's habits, but it's beyond that. And it really has to come, in our society, it has to come from people in power, in governments and companies that really have to change their values and align them with our responsibility to this planet, and to change our wastefulness and our need for money and growth and technology, so that we really all have to come onto the same page and work. And I think governments are going to have to connect with each other, and companies and technologies are going to have to learn to work together. It's really beyond the individual lifestyle.
Everybody needs to educate themselves as best they can about what's going on, and whatever steps you can take. I rent, so I'm not a homeowner. If you're a homeowner, then it would be wise to look into alternative energy sources so that we're not supporting the fossil fuel industry anymore. If you are in a position where you can afford to do so, then get an electric car, make lifestyle choices like that, make dietary changes so you're eating less meat. There's plenty of small things that people can do that might make a change, that might help, but it really takes the leadership of the world to decide that this is a crisis and that we need to do some major changes immediately.
Certainly as a mayor, the question almost daily is, what can I do in my public role in response to climate change? Publicly, as a mayor, my big challenge and what I'm searching for is predictability. how can I make a comprehensive, doable, sustainable plan to address what climate change throws Easthampton's way every day, whether that's flooding, whether that's rain instead of snow in the middle of February. It's really a challenge. We look at it from a crisis and emergency planning perspective, but also on just what we're using in City Hall for supplies, how we're dealing with the landscapes that we're responsible for in the plan for the pond. It's very hard to figure out what resources we'll need, how to budget for them, and keep them fluid. Personally, I am really conscious about what I use in my household, how I use my car, what products I am using, how I am repurposing, reusing, and recycling items in my home. There is a clear alignment between our global economic system and our national economic system and even our local economic system and climate change. And I think that there are opportunities that we can really grab onto to bring them together to work for a positive environmental change. We see that already with local restaurants who are responding to consumer preferences by using all paper takeout containers, not using plastic bags to put their food, the takeout food in, but paper bags. And that's a real start. You see in that very small example, I think it's the word that comes to mind is siloing. And that's unsiloing our economic system as well as our environmental efforts into one common purpose.
So I think that a place that could create a lot of jobs and economic growth is in home construction. I think there's a lot of work being done in this country and in other countries to use renewable and sustainable materials that create homes that are less impactful, that use the benefits of their surroundings for cooling and heating, and then materials that are found locally, and then using landscaping that is also beneficial and more like a natural connection to the existing habitat, so that it's not a huge footprint in an existing habitat. You know, the idea of using a desert landscape in Phoenix versus having 3 seasonal grasses that you replace every few months to maintain a green lawn because that's what you grew up with in Michigan. You know, it's not making a connection to the place that you choose to live. And I think that that's a place where we could be excited to really embrace technology that leads us in a more sustainable way. I think that local food production is also a place where we can make a lot of change, and people are, and I think that that's empowering because it gives people a purpose and it connects us to each other. The more that I know the person who's growing my food and the person who I'm buying it from, we all become a community and we're all sustaining each other instead of relying on someone providing something for us that we have no connection to.
Northern Europeans, since the enclosure laws in Britain in 1640, 1650, the commons were enclosed, the people were pushed out, and what started then was this trauma, this just multi-generational trauma of people who'd been forced away from the land, driven off these properties that they'd always used communally. As a storyteller, I'm really drawn to this question of what do we do with this trauma of having been driven out of our land? Like every one of us, you don't even have to go back that far, but every one of us has indigenous people in our background, because 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, that's what everybody was. And for us to be living these capitalist, modern industrial lives with all the great stuff that comes with that, I don't want to run any of that down. It's been fantastic to live in the modern times. But in terms of this ecological thread, I think we're finally getting to see that all of this industrially supported individualism is paying a price. And we're watching it happen globally. I mean, we can't escape these things. We try to gloss over them. We try to hide them from ourselves. But nature is out there underneath everything that we do. And I think that as Americans, we have a real longing to return to that. I think it's in our national narrative, you know, the ideal of the small farmer living close to the land. Even for a long time, our literature held, you know, even the city characters, they had an uncle, they had parents, they had grandparents who were still on the farm. And it was always important to have those people there. And there was a pride in that and a self-knowledge in that. Even after all the centuries of disruptions, we lived on the land. Whether it was Vermont and America's got this beautiful legacy for each of the different ecosystems. The rocky Massachusetts hills, you know, the Midwest and the Great Plains, people ranching out in the Rockies. There's this pride that we get to feel for the way that our culture has adapted itself to this landscape. The question is, how do we take care of people and change our behavior? I would say we just need to look inside and let ourselves admit that we really miss living close to Earth. That's in us. That's who we are. It's who we are as humans, and it's a good part of who we are as Americans. You know, the frontier self-reliance that let all kinds of things happen, you know, and that mentality has let all kinds of things happen. But I think we're starting to see the continents getting crowded. The effects of our emissions haven't just gone off into empty space. They're still there too. And so it's almost like we're haunting ourselves with our own emissions, you know? And I think that we're gonna have to figure out what our relationship with the earth is gonna be, and what our relationship with ourselves is gonna be, and our production is gonna be. And I think that that's a question that actually gives me faith, because I think that people know, and I think that there's a light and a natural thing inside of people that they know where their origins are. And I think it's gonna take some, you know, interesting storytelling and disruptions and a whole, you know, everything, the whole range of rituals. We've been led by corporations to think that everything comes from this vast hidden distribution network, and you get it on Route 9, you get it at the box stores, that's where everything comes from. And I think that people are I think there's a real hunger for people to find the creative ways to get back to the earth one way or another. And I see it with people, my friends who have kids, are always trying to get them out, you know? But I think in a way they're setting those kids up for the same sacrifices that we had to make as kids, because I grew up in the woods, you know, down at the stream, catching turtles and snakes and whatever we could find. We didn't know what to do with them because it was just a bourgeois, you know, middle-class suburban thing to do. We weren't eating any of those things. But now I think people are starting to look for ways to get back. I think people are hungry for it. I just don't think they know where to go. I mean, I think if people could understand, if we didn't have Fox News pouring poison into the American waters every day, the Green New Deal everybody would be on board with it, you know, except we have big business running the show and they're not on board with it. So that's where class and corporations are going to become part of the problem, because they're the ones who don't want to change. You know, if you asked the people, do you want clean air and water? They're going to say yes. The executives at Monsanto with their lobbyists are going to say, yeah, that's cute. We can't afford that. It's cheaper for us to do it this way.
What motivates people to change? That's probably a good question to ask in this whole thing is, and I think often people are motivated to make a change in their lives when something affects them personally. And so if you live in the valley here, you're not that affected by climate change, really. I mean, in a big way, yeah, you are, because we're all part of everything, and we can't avoid being affected by hotter summers and those kind of things. But I think it's easy to forget how much damage is being caused to the environment on a daily basis, because we don't see most of it here. And it's easy to kind of stick our heads in the sand. So I'm not sure what the answer is to motivate people to change their lives to the extent that we have an impact on the destruction that's going on. I wish I had an answer, but until we're all personally affected, we may not change, and by then, it may be too late.
A short story that really underscores my core beliefs around the environment and coming together and unsiloing economic and societal, cultural, and environmental concerns comes from the experience I had living off-grid on a boat in the California Delta. And waking up in the morning and seeing nothing but water and reeds from the edge of my barge, and just looking at the wonder of it, but then also seeing the color, the dark gray and orange color of the clouds that were over Richmond where the oil refineries were. Every once in a while, the glossy sheen of oil on the water or the dead fish that would pop out from some environmental incident. And then seeing the very best of that part of the world unfettered, and seeing wild animals and folks farming on those islands. It really was a clear dichotomy, and something I go back to over and over again of what can be and what can be spoiled so quickly, and something that we shouldn't lose. My most concrete connection to the environment and to our community is one and the same, and it's air. I wake up in the morning and I take a big breath of air through my nose, out my mouth a couple of times to just take in what's around in my environment, and to remember memories of my youth and standing on Mount Tom. I grew up in Holyoke, and what that smelled like and what it can smell like now or in the last couple of years. A bright spot is it smells a little better with the coal plant taken down and not in operation. And I remember that from when I was a kid, and that makes me smile. But also as I'm walking out my backyard and looking over the oxbow and smelling different things that come from the highway, or possibly chemicals used to keep at bay weeds and brush on the bike path.
One of my interests for maybe 40 years has been learning about wild mushrooms, because I like to eat them and I like to learn about them and discover them and understand their role in our ecosystems. And so every summer and spring and fall, I'm out in the woods picking mushrooms to eat. And when I pick those mushrooms, which are the fruit of the fungus that lives underground, that's connected to all the trees, when I eat those mushrooms, I feel like I have the forest inside of me. And so that's about as deep a connection as I can think of in terms of how do I connect to nature. And the process of collecting those mushrooms, I'm in the forest, I'm aware of what is growing in the forest and what animals are living in the forest. So it really is a very intimate connection with nature that my hobby provides. I think that my deep knowledge of the natural world, it gives me a sense of security, I guess, and confidence when I'm out in nature, that I'm not afraid of anything out there, because there's nothing to be afraid about other than getting lost in the woods, which is my own fault. But no, I think we're all part of this natural world, whether we feel like we are or not, we are. And so it's good to know your neighborhood. And that's my way of trying to understand my place in the world, and the world in general is connecting with nature. It gives me a sense of serenity when everything around me is crazy. Remember, there is no fake news in nature. So if I want to get the truth, I go to nature.
Many people have that story, right, or that place they like to go to every summer, or they did as a child, or they did that one time where they remember the way the water felt, or the way that the wind moved, or the birds sounded, or the view. You know, that place where you feel more like yourself, the place where you feel more at peace, the place where you and your family feel more connected and grounded. And you know, for my family, like I said, we go camping every summer. We go to the same place, and we go with 2 other families that are really close to us. And, you know, I think a lot of people can relate to this idea that you can always take a kid out of a suburban, technology-filled, you know, lifestyle and take them to the woods, and they know exactly what to do. Kids know how to play in the dirt. Kids know how to climb a tree. Kids know how to run, you know, in the woods for hours. They don't lose that sense and love of nature. It's always there. You just have to find ways of providing it. And I think as adults, you know, it isn't until I'm floating down the river that I like feel like I've reset, you know, my sensory load, and that I can be myself again, whether that means being, you know, the person I was as a child or who I want to be. You know, it can be whatever you want it to be. You know, I grew up in Phoenix, and I still have family out there, and we went to see my grandmother several years ago, and my husband grew up here in Massachusetts and had never been to the Grand Canyon and really wanted to go. And I said, we're never going to have enough time to go to the Grand Canyon. It's like a 3-hour drive. And he said, well, I've never been 3 hours from the Grand Canyon before. We need to go. And I realized, you know, how important that was for him. And so we did it. And it was the best decision I'd ever made, because as a child, I had driven to northern Arizona every year, many, many times, and never taken in the landscape the way I did as an adult who had been removed from that landscape for decades. And if you've ever been from Phoenix to Flagstaff and through Prescott, and you drive up into the area of where the Grand Canyon is on the lower side there, you go through, first you come out of Phoenix, and it's arid desert, right? It's low brush, if anything. And then you get to this place that's like a saguaro forest. And you know, a saguaro cactus, I believe takes anywhere from like 70 to 100 years to grow one arm. And they have water inside them. So they're huge lightning rods, really. And so for a saguaro to live long enough, not to rot, not to be taken down by birds, not to be struck by lightning, to grow an arm is a great deal. And here's this forest where there were just hundreds of saguaros with multiple arms piled up on top of each other, 1 to 2 different leaders. It was so magical. And then you move on from there, and it became this more like a plains where there was more understory type, you know, like grass. And then from there, you moved into the Ponderosa pine forest, which was like something out of a fairy tale, where you have these tall, vertical pines and no middle story and really no understory other than grass. And so it felt like you should see little woodland creatures like running in between the trees. It was so magical. And then you returned back to this desert landscape with the red rocks and the large mountains and the outcroppings of stone. And it was like a journey. And to be in a car for 3 hours and to feel like you were being given this gift of exploring landscape after landscape after landscape. You know, I don't even know if it mattered once we got to the Grand Canyon, because there were so many breathtaking and unusual landscapes along the way that the Grand Canyon was just like the finale of a fireworks show. And I think that unfortunately our lives keep us tied down to one part, and it's really a unique thing when people, you know, people make the decision to go and explore different landscapes and take themselves outside of, right? You know, we spoke before about, you know, has climate change impacted me personally? And I think this is still the same thing, that if we're not living in that landscape, if we're not experiencing that event, if we're not experiencing that change, it's really hard as a human being to take it seriously. And I think that, you know, because I grew up in Arizona, if I see something on the news about Arizona, I'm instantly more connected to it. Versus if it's something in, you know, I don't know, Utah, some state that I'm not tied to. And it doesn't really change whatever the event is that's going on for that state or for those people. And I shouldn't really feel more driven to empathize with them. But I think it's just human nature that we have to have these connections. And so the more that we pay attention to the connections we have in nature, and then the more we expand our knowledge of what nature is and what it looks like, I think those will be so impactful for this movement of change and environmental sustainability.
What an awesome responsibility and opportunity, right, to have humanity listen to one person. To lead us out of the mess, if I had that power, that influence over all of humanity, I would start building tables in, not maybe in the literal sense, but figuratively. I would ask humanity to come together, and not just come together and hold hands and sing songs, but literally come together and have conversations about what climate change means for them on their street, what it means for them and their children, what it means for them and their businesses, and find common threads and disappointments, and then opportunity. I believe that the innovation that we've seen in the United States over the last 250 years is extremely meaningful, but I don't think it's exclusive. And when we're breaking down barriers and silos and getting folks from all walks of life, around in one conversation to figure out a common good and a way forward, we can all own a little bit of that. So maybe that's somebody like me who's using vinegar and water and a little bit of mint oil to clean my house. Or maybe that's a repurposing of spent oil by a business down the street, or the refineries in Richmond or in China with coal, and capturing those harmful chemicals and doing something to contain them to allow the person who lives down the street in China to grow their own food. And to put some more leafy greens on our planet to reduce carbon emissions. Everybody can hold a piece of us going forward, but we need to know what piece we can hold, and we need to know that the piece we're holding is connecting to everybody around us.
If I was king of the world, what would I do to change the direction that we're going in and be not so self-destructive? Well, I guess we'd have to get all those big corporations in one room and tell them it's time to change our act. It's time to find alternatives to the way that we've been abusing the planet. It's time for people to realize that everybody has an impact on the only planet that we have, and we need to think about how we can change, whether it's alternative energy, whether it's changing our diets, whether it's not buying certain products because they are harming the environment. There's a lot of things that could be done, but it takes will, and it takes those in power to decide that that's what we need to do. And until that time comes, good luck. I'm sorry I don't have a more positive message, but it's difficult for somebody like myself who knows so much about the environment and the natural world to find a lot of encouragement these days. And yeah, it's disheartening to keep reading about what's going on.
I would require everyone to go vegan. Number one, I would shut down all the farms that have animals.
Changes coming from a governmental perspective or level. So I would want to see governments or our government creating renewable, sustainable practices in communities and making them available to local citizens, right? Replacing our electricity with renewable, whether that's wind or water or solar, depending on where you live, utilizing that, and then making that available, so that homes are being installed with heating and cooling systems that can utilize that renewable energy, and then providing homeowners with environmentally sustainable, whether it's solar panels or replacing windows, and we are going that way to some degree, but I think that it takes a lot of time and savviness on the homeowner's perspective to get that stuff done, and that I would want it to be just widespread, that we're all doing this, it's going to happen for everybody. And then, and then that way too, you would think that it would also impact housing, that if we were all creating these sustainable homes that were economically sustainable, that it would also increase the ability to house people who are struggling to find homes. And I would want to see these systems come through the school system. As a teacher, who's making a lot of changes in my personal life and in my home, it's very hard to work in a building where there's styrofoam trays being thrown in a trash can, where children are being fed food that I really wouldn't want them eating, and they're not coming from some sustainable places. And so I think, in my magical dream world, it would be amazing if communities were creating the food that the children in the schools were eating, and that there were jobs, local jobs being provided to the people who are growing that food, the people who are processing that food, the people who are making the food, the people who are, providing us with the materials to serve it, the ways of cleaning it. I think that there's so many pieces to the infrastructure that makes us sustainable, and it's exciting to think about all the different ways that we can all be a part of that. And that's what I would hope for. Just these communities where, the supermarket is filled with loose items that you can weigh out and put in paper bags. That's not a big change. Food that's coming. I've struggled to find research on how to eat locally in terms of, and I know it's true that if you just buy from farmers market, you will be buying food that is in season. But that's not always affordable for everybody. And sometimes if that food market only happens once a week in another community, it's not always attainable to get there. But I think that if our supermarkets reflected more of what is really capable of growing in our local environment, that would be ideal. I think it's asking a lot of the consumer to make the more conscious choice, right, on a daily basis, to know that, well, I could eat those grapes that came in that plastic bag that were grown in Peru, or or I could make the choice not to. But we're asking a lot of individuals, and I think that if we were surrounded by more opportunity to make better choices, I think that it wouldn't be so disheartening for individuals. It wouldn't be so. People wouldn't be so fearful of change if it was just part of our environment and our culture, that we're all going to do this together. That would be my dream.
I feel a little weird as the son of the suburbs saying this, because we were raised with no religion, just literally American consumerism was the religion that we were raised with. Never went to a house of worship. We were just, here's the world. It's the 80s. Enjoy it. Right? That's your legacy. And by starting to listen to voices outside of that, and by starting to spend a lot of time in nature and just long hikes, not high tech, not adventure, just finding the nature nearby and going out to it, and stopping along the trail and listening, and realizing that other people were having their day in the woods, the deer people were having their day, and the fox and coyote people were just going about their business. But to start to see all those other lives, I feel like somewhere along the line I got converted. to just realize that we're living in the middle of, I mean, this is also ecology, is everything's connected to everything else, right? But we're living inside of a house that we're not taking very good care of, and a lot of other people live here. And human beings, the American capitalists, are being these really terrible house guests. I don't know whether to say it became like a religion to go out to the woods, or to nature, to the ocean, to the rivers, or whether it just became like this invisible ideology that just is my way of life now. That it just, taking the personhood of everything around seriously, once you start, it just crystallizes and everything becomes a person. Everything deserves to be treated like a person, right? I think that if we're all gonna act together and hope that we're gonna be able to do the hard work of budging the needle on this, I would want to lay that groundwork by having folks over for dinner all the time, right? Just on a personal level, because this is a fight we're going to be in for. And I'll say this, if we're not going to get to know each other to get in for the fight, we should get to know each other in advance of the consequences that are coming when we lose the fight. One way or another, I think we need to have a lot more dinner parties and talking time to get people to have these feelings with each other and share it, and then make a basis for action out of that. That would be my human scale answer. But yeah, transitioning away from fossil fuels, putting my brother, the petroleum geologist, out of business, getting a lot of solar up, figuring out how to live on less energy, I think would be a great place to start.
Important next steps, and we see this happening in different parts of the world, and the Sunrise Movement, I think, really demonstrates that, is a certain fearlessness. We have some choices to make, and those choices are uncomfortable. The way we're doing some of the things in government and just living our daily lives are really impacting our hope and possibility for a bright future. Not only for generations to come, but this generation, for you and I. And to have those conversations and be okay with making the comfortable choice and truly understanding the pros and the cons, and that we're definitely going to lose how we live now, but it's only to live a better life today and tomorrow. And to add that into public conversation, and to add that into conversations around a dinner table or in a coffee shop, are really important. I would love to figure out a way to know about those conversations and get them shared more widely, and how to embed those conversations with real impact that are attached to conversations with action steps to embed those into our government. And when we're looking at our economic system and changing it, I think a more descriptive or appropriate word that can happen really right now in the present time is evolution, right? So for a business in our current system, for a business person, for the average worker, it's giving those folks that are deeply embedded in the economic system, and it's their livelihood, the opportunity that is feasible to unsilo and evolve their consumer products as they put them out to the market, but also as they consume them in the course of doing business. Unsiloing also the environmental movement and climate change groups who are very well studied and have tremendous points and have really been, kind of waving the red flag for decades now, and bringing forward some of the science and research they have and applying it to the current economic system, again, on the local and national and global level. There's a clear opportunity that we see happening right now on Cottage Street restaurants, but certainly can be applied to a wider application by unsiloing the need for our economy to thrive, as well as the absolute need that our planet needs to thrive, because that's how we thrive together.